Guys, Jason Bodine coming at you from Gadsden, Alabama. Welcome to the channel. Friday night, my family got together for an early Easter dinner. And the holiday being what it was, and these people being who they are, during the course of the night, a certain religious subject came up that got my wheels spinning and inspired the topic for this video. What religious people should think about, but don't. Now, your boy Jason here is no fool. I know a lot of people won't be able to sit through this video. The things I have to say aren't exclusively aimed at Christians. It applies to any religion, but all my talking points do draw from that specific faith and might be hard for some people to hear and to accept. So if you do make it all the way through the end, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. This whole discussion is centered around several principles. First is, if your religion's sacred text is, like the Bible for Christianity, specific in what it allows and what it prohibits, then what that text doesn't say is just as important as what it does. 2, if your religion's sacred text is to be treated as absolute literal truth with no room whatsoever for interpretation, then it's important to know exactly what that text says in the original language in which it was written. Don't rely on translations. Translations and translators are notoriously unreliable. Either the translator has an ulterior motive, or else they are trying to translate a concept from one language to another that has no direct translation. 3rd, the historical context surrounding the sacred text informs the meaning behind its passages. And 4th, this one is more of a general principle that applies to everything. It's that if people understood the first 3 principles in that list, they'd develop a deeper appreciation for their own faith and understanding for the people around them. Okay, now, since I opened with Friday night, we'll start with what was discussed that night, apply those principles to that, and then move on to a second example. Full disclosure, y'all. The order I just listed the first 2 principles in isn't the order I wrote them in my script. That's because the second principle, as written, applies more to my first talking point, whereas we can apply the full list to my second. I have one relative whose baby just turned a year old and another one with one on the way. This being the case, somebody at the party Friday brought up that be fruitful and multiply was God's first command to mankind in the Garden of Eden. I knew right then and there, sitting in my chair at the dinner table, that if I chose to, I could short-circuit that whole conversation just by asking one simple question. I chose not to ask it because I knew it would lead to one of 2 possible outcomes. It could lead to thought-provoking, deep conversation as people actually thought about the answer, but more likely it would lead to loud, red-faced chaos, because as a general rule, people don't like to think about things that challenge their notions. I didn't ask the question Friday night, but I'll ask it here to you guys. When God gave that command in the Garden of Eden, do you believe that he was talking to straight, married, fertile couples? Or was he giving the command to the whole human race? I can almost guarantee that 100% of the Christians watching me right now will answer that it's the latter. And given what the text literally says, rightly so. But that interpretation brings with it a whole slew of problems regarding the modern Christian's attitude towards people who don't fit that straight, married, fertile couple mold, having kids. And the reason why is in what Genesis doesn't say. Excuse me. For starters, Eve may have performed the function of a wife, but nowhere does Genesis mention a wedding ceremony for Adam and Eve. That's because the command was be fruitful and multiply, not fall in love, get married and multiply. The way that part of the story in Genesis went down, in a nutshell, was this. God puts Adam to sleep, takes his rib and makes Eve, wakes them up, introduces them to each other, and then essentially says, go and make more people. That's it. Now, there's also the fact that if that part of the story is to be taken literally, knowing what we know today about how genetics works, that would in all likelihood make Eve Adam's sister. But fishing with that can of worms will catch something big and ugly, so we won't open it. The important point is that marriage doesn't enter anywhere into the story of Adam and Eve. Nor does that command, be fruitful and multiply, impose any exceptions or limitations on who is to be fruitful and multiply. In 2026, this is something that religious people, especially those who follow one of the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, should think about but don't, because it challenges their interpretations of what their sacred texts say, and thinking about it presents a huge moral problem they don't have an answer for. Simply put, if be fruitful and multiply is for everyone, and you're one of those people who believes that people who don't fit into the straight, married, and fertile mold should have kids, aren't you yourself committing a sin by doubting God's word and advocating for those other groups to disobey it? Considering that that same sacred text also contains passages about not judging lest you get judged yourself, and basically minding your own business, I would argue that the answer to that question is in all likelihood yes. Now let's talk about my second point. My next talking point, I'm going to revisit something that I've already covered in another video, because it is the perfect example of something that appears to say one thing, but when you apply those principles I opened this video with to it, it changes the meaning completely and gives followers of this particular faith something they should think about, even though they don't, because again, they don't want their notions challenged. I am, of course, referring to every Christian's favorite justification for treating the LGBT community like second-class citizens. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, and its companion verse, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. For those of you who need a recap, modern translations of those two verses read as follows. 18:22 states, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." And 2013 states, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them." Now, Leviticus is a book of laws for the ancient Israelite people, or the ancient Israelite people rather, and it gets pretty darn specific in what it allows and what it prohibits, and that's important. Keep that in mind. For most Christians today, this is a clear prohibition against homosexuality, and there's no need to delve any deeper. But when you do delve deeper, when you look at the original language of the passages, consider what Leviticus does not say, and factor in the historical context in which those passages were written, the real meaning of those passages starts to show itself. And it isn't a moral judgment against homosexuality. It's about protecting male honor and status in the patriarchal society of that time. Since the proof is in the pudding, let me pick it apart for you so you can see what I mean for yourself. Okay, the first clue is in the words used in the original Hebrew text. Ancient documents were very careful to be specific about the wording of their documents because meanings needed to be made very, very clear. Modern linguistic scholars point out that when interactions of any kind between the two adult men took place and were discussed, the same word was used for both parties. But that's not what we find in Leviticus. Instead, the author or authors of these two passages paired two different words. Ish, meaning an adult man, and zakar, meaning a male of any age, including minors. Now, by itself, this might seem like an affirmation of the modern interpretation. But to linguists and translators, the use of two different words was significant. And up until 1946, when the word homosexual was first coined, Bibles always interpreted these passages as forbidding pederasty, which is such relationships between an adult man and a minor boy. The second clue lies in what Leviticus doesn't say. Since, as I said, Leviticus tends to be very, very, very specific, and it doesn't speak in generalities, if these two verses were intended to condemn all same-sex acts, you would expect to find equivalent verses condemning female-female relationships. You don't. There are none. Now, nor, interestingly, did you find equivalent passages to the pederasty interpretation. And that's perhaps the biggest clue of them all, because this directly ties into that third principle in our list, historical context, and tells us exactly what those two passages are really all about. Ancient Israelite society was patriarchal. Only adult men in that society had any kind of status whatsoever. Women and children were considered property under the laws of that society, to be owned and traded by those adult men. Young girls between the ages of 12 and 14, which is right around the time puberty hits, were frequently and routinely, in fact, married off to much older men. So the lack of equivalent passages regarding female relationships speaks to the fact that these two passages are specifically aimed at men only and are about their status in society, not a condemnation of their sexuality. To the ancient Israelites, the passive male in the relationship's status was lowered to that of a woman, and neither he nor the active partner had any status in or worth to that patriarchal society, and that in a nutshell is what those two passages are about. Now, today in 2026, we only see such views and treatment of women, children, and the LGBT community in areas of the world run by Sharia law under Islamic regimes. And we condemn it, ladies and gentlemen. So when you take all of that into account, religious people who view homosexual relationships between consenting adults as sinful and wrong really should ask themselves, is that really what Leviticus says? Or am I following the word of a translator with an ulterior motive and the precepts of cultural practices I consider wrong when another religion does it? But again, they don't, because they don't want their views challenged. Okay guys, so I was going to stop with those two talking points and go ahead and close out with my fourth and final unifying principle. But I realized in the course of filming those two talking points that there's another stop we need to make along the way. And it's an important one because it applies to both of those talking points and provides a perfect segue into that fourth principle. And that's that whenever you do anything like add conditions to be fruitful and multiply that aren't actually in the text, or you follow the translation of something rather than what the original text actually says, what you risk doing is adding words and meaning to that sacred text, and that is something that this particular sacred text, the Bible, strictly prohibits in 3 different places across the Old and New Testaments. That's a big no-no. Okay, so that leads us to that fourth and final principle, which unifies everything here. It's that by understanding those first 3, you gain a greater appreciation for your own faith and a greater understanding of the people around you. And quite frankly, guys, this is an important concept to consider, because reading your sacred text, whether you are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, or any other faith, and I'm sure that I could look in the sacred texts of other faiths and find similar examples and make similar arguments. I've only focused on Christianity here because that is the one I'm most familiar with. But if you can study your sacred text with those 3 things in mind and learn to understand it that way, that really is the only way that you can be sure that you are following its precepts to the letter. Quite frankly, guys, if you do you, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do or how to live, but I kind of feel like if you don't do that, then you take the risk of when it's your time to go, you might just, the afterlife you end up in might not be the one that you were expecting to go to. And I don't know about you, but that's a gamble that I personally and just not willing to take. So guys, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. Please be sure to give me a like and to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment down there in the comment section if you've got something to say. Okay, so I'll see you for the next one. Until next time, guys. Peace.